yes, we can build a society when we come together and everyone decides together what the morals are. The issues that we're having right now is not that our morality really is that different. Everyone wants to be free. Everyone wants to raise their children how they want. Everyone wants to feel safe and heard. But the fact that we have such division in this country is not a reflection of someone on the opposite political party than you. It is a reflection of the fact that these systems and these institutions are just not fucking working for any of us. Republicans hate big government and big corporations just like the liberals do, right? Like, we're all trying to, and that's a total generalization. Like, don't come at me with, actually, I'm a da-da-da. Okay, the concept I'm trying to get across to you right now is that we're all so disempowered with how we have set up this system, and the systems that we have in place, the institutions we have in place, including religion and patriarchy and all of these things, they got us to where we are here in human evolution. Like, we can thank them for their time. Thank you for what you've done for us, but you are not serving our needs anymore. And that's why we're having all of these tumultuous changes all at once. I know you guys feel this. I know you guys feel that all of these changes are happening at once because all of these institutions are just not working for us. And yeah, I do think it's possible for us to come together and be like, hey, we need to build something better. How can we do that in a way that minimizes suffering and, maximizes the benefit and the health of all? It's absolutely 100% possible because on a smaller scale, we've been doing this within our own communities forever. Every single denomination of Christianity is an example of this. Every single, government is essentially an example of this. Now, in the United States, when we had the founding fathers write the Constitution, yeah, they did this. They absolutely came together and were like, hey, what morals matter to us? What should we instill in this country? And they wrote in the Constitution, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Love that. A great perspective. I have no hate against the founding fathers. I mean, some of them, there were issues for sure. They're still people. But unfortunately, when we're talking about the foundation of a country that was based on representation conceptually from the beginning, it wasn't representing the women and any people of color, was it? Like, it was just white men still. And so in this country specifically, the issues we have are so imbalanced. And a lot of people come to me and they talk about identity politics. And to that I say, identity politics is just a dressed up way of saying that the identities of certain people have belonged to different classes for too long, and the members of the lower classes of whatever these identities that were disempowered for a long time are in, they're kind of fucking done and they're ready to rise up. And so that's class consciousness is something that's really important to me and what I'll be talking about in future episodes. And that's kind of like why I call myself a leftist specifically as well, because to me, these conversations of politics and religions are so intertwined and they are affecting everything about how we're making decisions in this country. And if we really want to shed the shackle of institutions that aren't serving us anymore, I'm not talking about in a violent way, I'm not an anarchist, but if we really want to shed, it's really just, in our mind, if we really want to shed these ideologies that are so harmful to us, including capitalism, including consumerism, then it really is time to start thinking critically and start thinking for ourselves. And so that's why I talk about empowerment too, because when we find our sense of authentic self-expression, we are more able to be active participants in this society. And a great example of that is me. Because for the first few years after I deconstructed, I was spending too much time trying to escape my existentialism. And then I had to spend a few years, kind of in the darkest era of my life because I had all of this baggage that I had shed and I was so lost and directionless and I didn't know what to do. Well, then I had to spend a few years building myself back up and deciding what does matter to me and what my values are. And now I'm finally here, again, being an active participant in my society. I'm feeling great. I'm going to hot yoga every morning at 5:30. Okay, like life is finally like on the up, but it's also better than it's ever been because I feel so free and I am not nearly as shackled as I was this time 15 years ago. And so that's a great example of like, it's going to take some work to shed the shackles of these institutions that are now preying on us, whether or not they were originally intended to do so. Okay. And one thing I like to bring up here when it comes to moral relativism and how we can shape a society that has that kind of speaks to everyone's points of views and backgrounds and perspectives. That's why I call myself a pluralist as well. Like, I don't want to create an atheist country. I want a pluralist country where both atheists and Christians and everyone else has a seat at the table. Right now, it is so one-sided. And there's this really interesting concept in philosophy called the conjecture of refutation. This was kind of coined by a philosopher named Karl Popper. And the idea is that we might not ever get to an absolute truth, capital T truth, but by refuting smaller truth claims over and over again, we can get closer and closer. It's kind of like in math where like the limit does not exist and you just keep approaching the line that you want to actually meet, but you'll never actually get there. You'll just get closer and closer and closer. But in the conjecture of refutation, you do this by determining everything that is not close to that ideal truth. So we can use this in the concept of like defining the moral progression of human evolution in a way that says we have over and over again shed the weight of supposed moral standpoints that do not serve us anymore. Guess what? It used to be moral to sacrifice children to angry gods. And that was like a societally accepted practice. Like they all thought that was actually moral. And guess what? We said, no, we would like to refute that and find something better. And so to me, I really do think it's possible. I want us to be able to work toward that together. And so when I openly call myself an atheist and a leftist, it's to speak to these systems of Christianity and the religious right that are really keeping even their own constituents, even their own followers, super disempowered and not able to think for themselves and specifically living in as much fear as possible so that they're easier to control. That's what I'm speaking to. I'm trying to push against these institutions that are harming us all. Another reason I call myself an atheist, though, to kind of switch gears and kind of go back to my dilly-dallying in New Age spirituality, is that I know for a fact that I am kind of prone to magical thinking. And this is something that has kind of been in my family and something that I have to keep an eye out for. Essentially, like, our brains are wired to find patterns for the sake of survival, but it's also been scientifically proven that our brains create meaning out of patterns that doesn't actually exist. So we can see this in like repeating numbers and saying like, oh, it's a sign, or seeing any kind of omen and interpreting it as, you know, some other being, whether it's aliens, a deity or whatever, communicating with us. And I am prone to seeing patterns. And there's a lot of reasons that might be. It might be because I was raised to analyze the Bible in such a way that every single number had a divinely inspired meaning and every single word had a divinely inspired meaning. And I was like taught that there were spiritually, divinely inspired patterns in this book. And who knows, maybe that kind of contributed to me going through phases of I actually have been professionally diagnosed with a full-fledged, like 2-month-long psychosis. Like, I've legitimately heard voices in my head and thought that beings were communicating to me. There was a time in 2019, and there are a lot of factors that went into why I went through a psychosis, but just to be super vulnerable here, like, yeah, I was hearing voices in my head. I thought that I was on this like quest and on this track. I thought the internet was communicating with, or I thought like aliens were communicating with me through the internet. I thought that people around me were either clones or robots. Don't get me started on birds. They still creep me out. And it was a really intense time. One of the ways I describe it is like, it felt like an acid trip for 2 months straight. Like, it was just, my brain was on fire. I was barely sleeping. I was seeing all of these patterns everywhere. And honestly, like, looking back, I was in a really unhealthy dynamic with a much older man who I was financially dependent on and who it was really unsafe for me to live there. and I was in it was a really dark, unhealthy situation, and I had been with him for a couple years at that point. And so my brain, like looking back, I very much can see that my brain was literally recreating a better reality for me so that I didn't have to deal with my survival. Because in that better reality, like, the voices were telling me I was going to be queen of the world. So it was honestly a really great fabrication that I think my brain was just like, you need to get the fuck out of here. And then once I remember the exact moment when the fog cleared. That's a really wild story that maybe I'll get to like on a Twitch stream or sometime or whatever. But I remember the exact moment the fog cleared, and I looked back at the past 2 months and I was like, oh fuck. I just lost it for 2 months. And it was all over the place, you guys. Like I was not trying to hurt myself or anything, but I was putting myself in harm's way, like thinking that like not on purpose, like on accident kind of thing. So I was so glad like when my brain fog cleared, but I remember the exact moment and I was like, oh fuck, that was quite literally insane. And then, yeah, like 6 months later, I finally like got enough money and left that guy. But, just to be a little bit vulnerable here. Yeah. One of the reasons I have to call myself an atheist is as a reminder of how easy it is for me to fall into the trap of spiritual psychosis and fall into these traps of like thinking that everything is a sign and an omen. And the thing is, here's where things are going to get interesting, because again, I call myself a spiritual atheist. Now we're going to kind of get into the second part of this conversation, because to me, it really is important to not, like when I was talking about deconstruction earlier from evangelical fundamentalist Christianity, like part of what I like to talk about is remembering to reconstruct your identity after the fact, because a lot of times it can be so easy to just fall into cycles of anger at religion and all of this stuff. And don't get me wrong, I have a serious rage against these institutions. Obviously, that's literally all I talk about now. But don't get me, like, there's still a place for anger, but when we're not actually actively building something better for both our individual selves, but also collectively, and for communities that we have lost once we left religion, when we're not actively fighting for those things and building those things, that's only like half the battle. And it's like defeating the purpose of leaving religion in the first place. Like, congratulations, you're free from the shackles of these thought patterns, but like, now what, And so to me, one of the reasons I call myself a spiritual atheist is because it helps me remember to still practice the mindfulness and intention setting and all of these little rituals that I still do. Like I follow the moon cycle, and I will, for example, now when I see repeating numbers, because I have transitioned to calling myself a spiritual atheist, like it's easy for me to see like 111 and be like, okay, I know deep down that doesn't actually mean anything in the grand scheme of things, but I actually am going to intentionally allow those repeating numbers to remind me that I'm exactly where I need to be, and I'm doing really fucking great, and I'm super hot, and I'm super smart. You know what? Yeah. 111 to me, right? But still, in the back of my mind, it's still like, obviously I know I'm making this up for myself. So that's kind of like the weird paradox, and the tension of calling myself a spiritual atheist really helps me to still find meaning in practice and like practice rituals and meditate and live a life of intention and contemplation and accepting this beauty and mystery and mysticism of this world without falling into traps of, one, magical thinking, and it's important for me to keep myself grounded, but two, it's not going to ever lead to me pretending like I've got it all figured out, right? Like, because I can call myself like a spiritual version of atheist, to me the spiritual, not religious kind of aspects I took from New Age spirituality is kind of what I have taken with me now. And it's this way of like choosing which tools of spirituality, like I do yoga, that's my workout of choice. I don't want to go to the gym and lift weights. That doesn't really fuel my inner being, but having the kind of like, the yoga, the quiet, the zen, but also like really strong poses and stuff, that really speaks to me, right? And I do meditate every morning, but I don't sit in a dark room and light a candle and, just sit in silence uncomfortably. I sit on my bed like with my back against pillows and I listen to funky music for 15 minutes every morning. Like, I think that it really is just a reminder for me to practice intention. And really, spirituality to me is about oneness. That's something that I think we are all kind of waking up to and realizing, as well as how interconnected literally everything is. Nothing is in a vacuum in this universe. And honestly, like, whenever people who are still kind of under the umbrella of spiritual talk about like infinite intelligence instead of God, or, whatever, like, I totally respect that. And I'm not an anti-theist. Again, I really have to call myself a theist for one, I don't think anything else makes sense outside of I don't think anything supernatural exists. Like, I just am in fact an atheist. But two, calling myself an atheist just actually helps me stay grounded. But paradox is really, really important to me. It kind of explains so much of reality in my perspective. Like, we all know of the idea of like the wave is the entire path of the particle. And to me, like, free will and determinism and morality, like all of those concepts, when I really think about them, they just kind of seem like paradoxes, because we know that time is not as like standard and concrete as we used to think. Like, time is relative. We learned this in the theory of relativity thanks to Einstein. Time is relative based on like space, right? Duh, Casey's like, what? With time being relative, whenever we talk about free will, it's like, have I already made this decision, or all of these decisions happening at once? Is it useful to think about these decisions like that? Like, to me, I also like to kind of break down some of these concepts in like theology and spirituality and rationalism or whatever, like free will or morality. It's like, okay, this can be a really interesting conversation to figure out if there's free will or determinism or not. And I can see how you can kind of fall into the trap of like really freaking out about whether or not we have free will. And I want to respect that. But at the end of the day, like, how useful is it to know whether or not for a fact that we have free will? How useful is it to know whether or not for a fact what happens after we die? How useful is it to know whether or not there's a God? Are any of these things either way really serving us one way or another? Because I honestly, like, genuinely don't think so. In reality, we have to practice that as if we have free will. We have to practice as if there is no God, because everyone disagrees on what that God would look like, right? We have to act as if We have to practice as if there is no afterlife, because what if there isn't and we're wasting this one chance we have? And I know like Christians will flip that and be like, what if you're wrong and there's a hell? Like, honestly, if I'm wrong and Christianity is the legitimate absolute truth, like, I don't want to go to heaven and hang out with you guys. I'm sorry. But yeah, so spiritual atheism to me, I hope this like goes to show how I think it's possible for us to all kind of define this new version of what we want for our lives ourselves, and how, you know, I'm not the only self-proclaimed spiritual atheist. Britt Hartley calls herself a spiritual atheist, and she's one of my favorite content creators right now. But it is important to kind of start sifting through everything we've been taught and then eventually reconstruct. And I think we can all do that together. Now, another part of why I call myself a spiritual atheist has to kind of do with atheism culture. So atheism culture, like not the concept of atheism as in you don't believe in God, but atheism culture itself kind of has a few downfalls. And of course, like, I cannot help but be anti-establishment. So even within the atheist community, like, there are kind of well-known voices, and there are people who kind of like founded these atheist movements. Like there's this thing called New Atheism, right? And it was these 4 white men who really brought about the concepts of atheism to the masses: Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, and Daniel Dennett. I've read a lot of works by these guys, and I love their work, and I'm super grateful that they brought this work to the public. But you know, as a result, I think that one of the interesting things about atheism culture is there are a lot more men than women who are atheists. And part of the reason this is because white men in this country have had more leisure than the other communities. So they are also more educated. They've been educated longer. They don't have to work as hard, all of this stuff that we're kind of realizing. And so as a result, what's interesting is like, as a result of that, a lot of them become atheists, and because they have a lot more time on their hands to really question the big questions of the universe and wonder about our place in it and whether or not God exists. And a lot of them end up as atheists. So that's kind of like a comforting thing to know, that a bunch of white men who had all of this privilege ended up as atheists. But it does mean that we're still kind of trying to piece together more representation in the atheist community, just like every other field. But, you know, and I have found a couple of women atheists, like content creators, on a very surface level exploration of atheist content online. Like, I've just now started making my content, and so I've just now kind of started diving into atheist content. So this is not a comprehensive overview, but Britt Hartley and Christy Burke are the only like women atheists I've really seen online right now. I mean, that's probably not, there are probably more, and I'm just not thinking of them right now, but you get the point. Like, another reason, like, I'm making this content and being open about atheism is kind of for representation, because I want women to know that we can still have this connection to the divine, what we call divine, you know, what we decide is divine and sacred and all of these things. We can still have a connection to nature and our bodies, and, you know, we can still have practices and rituals. And so that's like another reason I call myself a spiritual atheist, because on the whole, spirituality really does kind of speak to women who are leaving these patriarchal religions. Again, like I was saying, it's New Age spirituality is more feminine in nature. So that's another reason I use the word spiritual when talking about my atheism. I do want to give a couple of quotes. So Sam Harris in Waking Up says that our world is dangerously riven by religious doctrines that all educated people should condemn. And yet there is more to the human condition than science and secular culture generally admit. And that kind of speaks to what I'm saying. Like, science and secular culture, not science as a practice. Like, science is a technique of determining truths. It is not a belief system. It is a process of determining truths, right? And so science as a concept, great, love it. But science culture and the institution, I've talked about this before, like the institution of who were decided to be scientific authorities for so long were men. We're white men in this country specifically, but even before that, throughout human history, it's been men who've been allowed to have more education than women. And like the priests and the scholars and all of these things were men. And so that included science. Like, there was not a lot of representation there. And also the result of that is like women, and studies show that Black women in particular, they're not treated as legitimately in the healthcare system. Like, when a doctor treats a woman or a Black woman, they're less likely to take the symptoms seriously. Like, this has been proven over and over again. So there's still a lot within the institute. Of course, I cannot help it, challenge institutions, but the institution of science still has a lot of work to go, just like every other institution, but it's still by and far a much better starting point and grounding point, because its nature is to be skeptical and questioning and curious, as opposed to dogmatic and authoritarian and trying to control people with the truth. But I do think it's important, like Sam Harris said, like, I do think it's important that rationalism, if you just stick with rationalism and you never balance that out with trying to establish meaning and purpose, even though you know deep down that you're making these up as you go, like, that can lead to a super unfulfilling life. And who wants that? Like, so many atheists, that a lot of the atheist content I've seen, it's like, congratulations. I'm honestly like so glad that we're fighting back against these dogmas. And I'm doing the same thing too, right? I'm guilty of this too. Is like constantly talking about how Christianity is not true, and these concepts are not true, and this is true, and this it's appropriate to have skepticism here and there. It's like, congratulations, we're absolutely slaying the debates. I love that for us, but getting caught in the cycle of what's more logical and what's more rational without balancing it out actively, talking about like, hey, yes, I believe that we're moral relativists. Like, how are we putting that into practice? Like, that's what I want to see more of. And I'm not saying it doesn't exist. This is just a general kind of I dipped my toe into atheist culture and atheist content online, and this was my first impression, is there's not enough representation, and we need to be more intentional about creating meaning and purpose within our lives, recognizing that it's all made up, and the points don't matter. Isn't that the line for Whose Line Is It Anyways? But so yeah, that's kind of another reason I want to call myself specifically a spiritual atheist. So so it's like, now what? What's next for religion and politics and these conversations that I'll keep having? Again, I think these concepts are super intertwined, religion and politics, because what informs our beliefs about the way the universe goes is going to inform what kind of society we create. And for so long, that has been intertwined with like military complexes and religion, because that was a way to keep people controlled and keep people safe from other institutions. Well, other governments, but now we're more globalized than ever, and also we're more informed than ever. So do we really need to be controlled by belief systems that don't serve us anymore? And do we really need to fight each other over the resources when we've seen microcosms of how shared resources benefit all, and like it feels a lot better on our conscience? Like, why are we exploiting third world countries and the working class and all of this stuff? Like, again, we're waking up to all of these institutions not working anymore. And I like to bring up Hegel's dialectic here. And this idea is that the clash of opposing forces or ideas out of which emerges a synthesis which would then in its turn be challenged by an opposing antithesis. So really what this concept is saying is like, whenever there are two opposing ideas in a society and a culture, and they're going back and forth, like out of them, this synthesis of the two, this kind of brand new version, not either or, but a synthesis of the two and taking the best and leaving the worst, emerges. And then over time, there will be backlash against that system. And that is how we continue progressing and evolving as the human species. Yeah, sometimes we might take a step back, but we're always going to take two steps forward after that. But the way we evolve, we can even see this in the family unit. The way we evolve is to rebel and to resist against that which has been, so that we can determine something better. That's why teenagers are rebellious. It is their job to get mad at their parent, to have their little hateful against the parents era, because we want them to live better lives and to have better lives than us. And so that's can be played out on a generational, like larger societal level as well. So whenever I'm talking about like these institutions are at their end, like I'm not being harmful. I'm not even being violent about it. I'm just saying this isn't working. These institutions are at the end of their life cycle. We need to start figuring out what is next. We must keep fighting. And that is why I call myself an atheist and a leftist, because both of those concepts are about rebuilding from the bottom up. So again, like I was talking about, when I shed all of the deconstructed, brainwashed beliefs that I had as a Christian, I started reconstructing my personal identity from the ground up, from nothing. And that's the same thing with leftism and like socialism and democratic socialism in particular, is all of the people in the working class come together and they decide, they democratically, yes, elect representatives and determine what the economy should look like on this level, not up here at the top, because that's what's currently going on. But whenever the bottom levels rise up and take ownership over these top level ways of organizing labor and the economy and rights, whenever we come together and rise up and we build from the bottom up instead of being told how to act and what to think and what to feel from the top down, that is when we will have another turn of the wheel in human evolution. And that is why it is so important for me to call myself both a spiritual atheist but also an atheist leftist. I do want to give you this final quote from Britt Hartley. This is in her book called No Nonsense Spirituality. It is like one of my favorite reads recently, and I highly recommend it. She says that people think if we just got rid of dictators and cult leaders, we would be free, but it's actually the other way around. We create dictators, religious leaders, and cult leaders because we so badly want someone else to tell us how to live our lives. And I think that has been so true for so long. But my purpose right now, my content, my Twitch streams are going to be about empowering us to determine how to feel, what to think, and how to live our lives for ourselves. And yes, I do mean that in a sense of community. Loneliness is still an issue. We shouldn't be as isolated as we are now, but it's about coming together in the here and now and stop letting these institutions that have no fucking concern about us in the world. They just want to get richer. They just want to get more power. Like, nobody is surprised by me saying this. We have to come together. We have to shed the shackles of beliefs. I know that sounds like so like woo woo and unshackle your mind, free yourself from like the Matrix and all that stuff. But it really is. Those really are like fair analogies. So I hope you guys have stayed this whole time. As you can tell, I really care about all of this. So I would love to interact with you. Go ahead and comment on any of my YouTube videos, or I would love to talk to you on Twitch. Again, I'm going to be streaming every week now. Sundays 12 to 6, Tuesdays and Thursdays 6 to 9 p.m. All of that is Central Standard Time, so I would love to see you there. You've been watching a clip from The Kayse Melone Show. For full episodes, subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Overcast, or Pocket Casts. And you can follow on TikTok, Instagram, or Blue Sky.